These beautiful things that I've got. Please don't take.
Good morning and welcome to the Well. If you haven't had a chance to meet me, my name is Danny. I am one of the pastors here at our church and excited and glad you're here. I'll add my welcome on top of Sadie's and Anne Marie's and those that you received, hopefully many pleasant ones on the way in the door this morning. But as Anne Marie said, we are in a sermon series called Mind Blowing, where we're looking at the what I would call mind blowing truth about the mission of Jesus. Sometimes I think we take the ideas of who Jesus is and what he taught and why he matters, and sometimes we water those down, or sometimes we parlay them into personal agenda or something that we're trying to push in that regard. And so what we're trying to do is really be as thoughtful as we can to push away any of the extra rhetoric or decision or hope or things that we might put on the mission of Jesus as we march closer and closer to Easter through this Lenten season, as Anne Marie said, and look at what Jesus' actual mission was. And I would say if we get to the core of who Jesus was and what his mission is, it actually is quite mind blowing, but it's not something that we're always told and it's not something we always talk about. And so I want us to get to the core of it the best we can, and maybe as simply as we can without trying to overcomplicate it and perhaps not undersimplify or oversimplify it as well. But if I was giving you like our main idea or our big idea sermon in a sense, it would be this: that the mission of Jesus is incredibly unfair. But I would say it is in the best way possible. I would say I'm someone that is quite interested in fairness, someone that cares a lot about equity and justice in many areas of life. But as a twin, I cared very deeply about justice because if my brother got something that he didn't earn, it was the most frustrating thing in the world to me. And even as a parent, I look around and sometimes I'll give one of my kids something and then the other one will be like, well, they didn't do all the work they deserved or that I did to get this. And sometimes we look at our faith and our spirituality the same sort of way, right? It's about fairness. It's about what we've earned. It's about what we've done. It's about what we accomplished. But I would say the mission of Jesus is unfair in the best way possible, and that is because of this. Because God's grace isn't about what we've earned, but rather what God has freely given to each and every one of us. And I think that is important because when we look at the mission of Jesus, one of the things that is often easy for us to do is turn it into a pursuit of ladder climbing, a pursuit of merit based achievements, a pursuit of doing more than the person next to me, beside me, in front, or behind me. That the only way that I can differentiate myself from others in the crowd and really be seen as loved and known by God is by stepping on some people in the process, pushing them down so that I could climb up. And I think that Jesus would have better for us than that. That the mission and the power of Jesus, though maybe on its head, seems somewhat unfair because it's about this equitable grace that is offered to each and every one of us, something that's not merit based. Uh, it's often hard for us to comprehend. Again, as a twin, this is something that like I went through my entire life. My twin brother and I, though we were twins, we look nothing alike. He has blonde, curly afro, blue eyes. He's also like double my size. That did not stop me or my parents from dressing us the same for the majority of our life. But what that meant was that I kept getting my twin brother, that I am 20 minutes older than, but half the size, his hand me downs, which is wild, for my whole life. So I'm like wearing third grade Scott stuff in sixth grade. And it was frustrating to me because I was always like, man, when am I ever going to get the new thing from? When am I going to ever get the thing that I've earned? When am I going to get the thing that I deserve, the thing that I get that I want? And sometimes I think for us, again, when we think about our spiritual lives, it's easy for us to hunker down into a mindset and a mode of it is what I cultivate on my own. It's what I've earned on my own. It's what I've worked really hard because we're a Western American working culture, right? Like we work really hard in our professional lives and our academic lives. We put away 4, sometimes 8, maybe 10 years in our academic life to be able to get the career we want. We spend years, sometimes decades, grinding away at the job that we feel like we want so we can finally sit in the chair that we've always dreamt of being in. And our hard work is something that I think many of us possess. But when that becomes the only thing that we care about, I think that we start to care less about the goodness of God's grace because it doesn't have anything to do with that anymore. It has to do with what we have done. And so I want to examine a story that kind of puts this into perspective for us. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Matthew 20, verses 1 through about 16. And the story is kind of interesting. So it tells about this landowner who sends these workers out to go and work. And so he hires these workers and he sends them out. And it says this starting in verse 3. He went and got some workers around 9 in the morning and saw other workers standing around in the marketplace doing nothing and said to them, well, you also get to go into the vineyard and I'll pay you whatever is right. So they went and did this. So first he goes and he finds this set of workers. He's like, hey, I want to task you guys out to go do this. I'm going to pay you a rate. They agreed on this rate. And then eventually he's like, well, there's still a little bit more work to be done. So it says that later on in the day, around 9 o'clock, so you can imagine these people started at like 7 or something. 9 o'clock, he goes and gets these other people and he's like, well, there's still work to be done. So I'm going to pay them the same daily rate, even though they started a little bit later. He sends them out, pays them the same, and then they go into the vineyard. And he says that he finds them and they're not doing anything. So they're kind of like standing there, not doing anything, tasks them to go out, puts them to work. Then you fast forward to verses 6 and 7. It says about 5 in the afternoon. So now it's like even later in the day. There's been people working from 7, now people working at 9, all paid the same rate. And it says about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, why are you standing here and doing nothing all day long? And then I think their answer is kind of interesting. He says, well, because no one's hired us. If I was thinking about that in terms of ways to look at, like, one, either no one hired me, like that's obviously what they're saying. But think about this in terms of like inviting people to something, like, well, why didn't you come to this? Well, no one asked me to come. No one asked me to do it. Why aren't you doing this job that should be done? No one asked me to do it. It wasn't on my radar. And they're like, this wasn't something that I was hired to do, asked to do. Then Jesus responds, or the landowner responds back, well, you can also go into the vineyard. Started at 5, still paid the same rate. And what's interesting about this story is that he hires these different workers all throughout the day, but he ends up paying them the same wage, which doesn't feel fair to the people that started at the beginning of the day, right? So put yourself into the shoes of the person that's working all day. Like, you might look at that and be like, well, of course, this is like the most unfair thing that's ever happened. Now, if you're someone that started at the end of the day, you're like, this is the greatest deal I've ever found. How can I find this work and do this for the rest of my life, right? But it starts this interesting idea around the economy of what God is doing. In the economy of grace, I think sometimes you look at the economy of grace the same way we at the economy of money. It's about how much time, effort, blood, sweat, and equity I put into this, and that is going to kind of inform what I get back out. But what I would say is the truth is that God's kingdom is not about merit. It's not about hard work, but it's ultimately about mercy. It's about something that God offers each and every one of us. It's not about merit. It's not about hard work. And we can see this lived out in this story. I mean, Jesus is telling this story around people that are building a faith. Like, he's telling this around tenants and workers. He's talking kind of a professional sense. But he's talking to the context of this. He's talking to people that are comparing themselves spiritually to people that have not been at it as long as them, right? Like, maybe I've been at it my entire life. I went to rabbinical school. I've become a rabbi. I've done this thing. Maybe someone that doesn't, if you remember the Pharisee and the tax collector parable, like, doesn't fast as much as I do, doesn't pray as much as I do, isn't involved as in many small groups as I am, right? Doing all of these things, this merit-based work. And he's teaching to this group using kind of an economic lens to help them understand, because that's the framework that they have now parlayed and put their spiritual life into. And he's trying to get them to shift their thinking a little bit to say, well, maybe the economy of what God is doing is different than the economy of what the world is doing. And I think this is important as well, because sometimes it's easy for us to say, well, we're in a Western 21st century culture. Easy for us to get caught up in the ladder climbing and all that. It seems to be that Jesus was fighting the same thing in the first century, right? This isn't just a Western convention, this idea of the economy of God's kingdom looking different than the economy of the world. But I do think for us, when we shifted away from merit back into God's grace and mercy, it shifts our understanding of both why the kingdom is valuable and how we have a part to play within it. But the story continues, and the workers revolt, right? Like, if you were a part of this, you would not be happy. Like, you would start a protest, or you do an uprising, you get your signs, and you go and you kind of be like, this isn't fair. I need to get better wages. I need to be treated a little bit better. And so they go to their owner, their boss, their tenant. He says, this isn't fair. And then his response back to them is like, well, I'm the one that's in charge. Like, am I allowed to do with my land and my work and my task what I want? Like, who gets to decide this? Are you begrudging my generosity? And I love this because the owner shifts it away from the economy of what is earned and back to an economy of generosity, like, which is not the way that they saw it. They did not see it as the owner being generous. They saw it as him being actually ungenerous, right? Because what they were doing was giving people who work not as long the exact same as the people that work a short amount or a long amount. And again, this parable, though it's framed in wages, it is not about wages. It's ultimately about grace. And that's what I would say, like, as you're thinking about this, like they're using terms of wages and money and denarius, the economic piece of money they're using, but this is all about the economy of grace. And I think that for us, when many of us look at grace, we think about it as transactional. Maybe this wasn't your experience, but I know in a pretty highly Catholic city, you perhaps have this. But I did not grow up in a Catholic context at all, and this was my idea of grace. I would go through my day as a child, and sometimes I would do things that were good. And I felt like, have you ever watched The Good Place? Anyone watch The Good Place? Yeah. So I felt like I would get like a thumbs up every time I did something good. So I was like kind of climbing the ladder. And every time I did something bad, it was like 5 steps backwards. And at the end of the day, like my prayers would be completely based on this tally I had in my head of if I was like over or under par on my score that I was shooting for. Was I doing all right? Or was I doing really poorly? Was I crushing it? Or was I negative? And that was the economy that I built in my mind. So I would go to God in my bed at night when I would pray and I'd be like, God, can we just get it back to zero? And I was never trying to get more. I was never trying to get less, but I was always like, can we get this thing back to zero? And I think for many of us, we look at grace in the same sort of transactional way. Like sometimes I feel like we feel like we're playing with house money all day long, and we're spending, we're throwing things away, and the economy of what God has given us. And then we get to the end of our day, and we're like, well, I really didn't do very good with that. And so I'm going to just hopefully pray that God puts me back at even. And if we look at parables in scripture, like not just ones about economy, but ones about specifically about grace, again, stories like the prodigal son. I was at another church last week and I preached this story of the prodigal son as well. So it's somewhat fresh in my mind. And this idea of one of the sons goes away and he spends everything and he comes back being like, I am in so much debt that there's no way that I could ever be received back. The economy that he understands grace in, he's like, there's no way that I could pull myself back, right? So he comes back, his father receives him without any sort of stipulations. He's like, you are welcome back. And what is interesting is like the father was always waiting for his son. He was always oriented in turn, but the son had to turn and go back to him, right? We talked about that a lot. So for him, he felt like he was in this massive debt. But the other person we don't talk a lot about in the story is the older son, right? Like he's sitting back in his room and he is resentful about the grace. He's like the other workers in the story. He's like, I've been at this all day. I've been working and you paid this other person who did a third of the work, is very minimal, didn't do anything to earn it, but they were paid the same wages. It actually feels like they're getting more. And sometimes when you feel like they get the same, even if it's a numerical amount, if you put in less work, it's like it does feel like they got more. And that's how this older brother feels. He begins to resent actually the generosity of God's grace. And one of the things that like crossed my mind is like thinking about for us where we sit in our seats today. Like some of us come in here and I think our challenge is to believe that God's economy of grace is big enough to pull us out of whatever perceived debt we're in. I think that's like many of us likely sit in that situation where we are so filled with guilt and shame and regret, and we're wondering like, man, can God actually pull me out of this debt? I think the promise and the mind-blowing truth is certainly yes, right? That every story we look at in Scripture is one of a God that is continually and not begrudgingly, but quite happily pulling us out of our perceived debt and helping us realize that we were never in as big of debt as we thought to begin with. Now, the other side of the story is, I think, to ask ourselves, are we like the older brother or the other tenants that have been at this all day? We've actually resented the generosity of God. Using myself as prime example, I know I certainly have. Like sometimes I look around and I see the things that I have done, or I pray, and there's certain people in my life that when I pray for, I'm like, I really want God to show this person grace. But like if you just ran out, it might be okay, right? Like, and I'm being honest, right? Like, I mean, I think if you've been in that situation before, like we all want God's grace to be abundant and overflowing. But when the real life economy of relationships and the things that we put in get mixed up in that, it's much harder for us to look at everyone, including our enemies, especially including the people that feel like they're getting more than us, that didn't deserve it, to view them as the same way that God views them, as these loved children of God. And I think that the issue is whether we're the person that feels like we're massively in debt, or perhaps we're resenting those that are getting more than they deserve. I think the question is to ask ourselves, are we more fixated on trying to be the arbiters of what people deserve? Or are we more fixated on the overwhelming and abundant generosity that God freely gives? I think sometimes we put ourselves like in the wrong seat at the table, right? Like we would value and say that everyone does have a seat at the table and there's nothing that you can do to lose that seat at the table, a mantra we often say here at the Well. But one of the things that's interesting is I think once we sit at the table and we see Jesus' disciples doing this, almost immediately they begin arguing about who is the greatest among the disciples, which is interesting. Like those closest to Jesus, those that presumably have it the most figured out, are still working in an economy of ladder climbing. And they're like, well, but Jesus, I know that we all have a seat at the table. And God, I know that you were called us all equals, but in that equality, which one of us is like slightly better than the other one, right? Who gets the seat of prominence in this? And I think the issue is that we often get caught up more in what we feel like we've earned or we deserved, and far less caught up on just the overwhelming abundance and good news of the grace that God offers us. And there's a really interesting passage that comes out of 1 Corinthians. It's in chapter 1, verse 23. And Paul is talking about what the gospel sounds like to people. And when I say the gospel, like that's sometimes a word that we don't know. Like at its core, it means good news, right? And the good news rooted in the story and the person and the power of Jesus, right? Like, so he's talking about when I'm going around, I'm telling people that Jesus lived and that he died and that he did everything that he said he would do and that he rose from the dead and he did all these things, like that sort of good news. He was talking about in 1 Corinthians 1:23, he says, when I go out and tell people about the gospel, which is Christ crucified and Christ risen, it's scandalous to the Jews and it's foolishness to the Gentiles. A way to say that in language we might understand or sounds more familiar at least is it's frustratingly scandalous to religious people, and it's overwhelmingly and unbelievably good news to the irreligious. The Gentiles would have been the people that were irreligious. The good news sounds so good it's foolish, right? You've probably been in those situations before where you're like, I'm not going to take this deal because I know that it's a scam, right? Like that's what the good news of Jesus sounds like to someone that is irreligious, what Paul is saying here. But to the people that have been at it their whole life, the people that have put in all their chips, that perhaps have sunk everything into it, have felt like they've got or not got everything that they've earned and deserved and actually deserved and earned a little more, it's actually scandalous to those people. And so if I was giving us like a couple of things to think about in regards to what we do with this kind of economy of God's grace and how we can actually embrace this mind-blowing truth of Jesus, it would be these couple of things. First, meaning that like latecomers are not left out, that no one is too late to receive God's grace. I think one of the things that prevents us from this is we think about it like the wage workers, right? Like, did I start at 9 or did I start at 5? Like, how late is too late? How early is too early? Like, there is no too early. There is no too late to be someone that can participate and engage in and receive the grace of God. And I think that's a wonderfully good news, because that means that at any point, it is not about what God has given to us, because God has freely offered it. It's about our posture of recognizing, seeing, and receiving it. And so no one is too early. There are no too late comers for that. But the other thing that I would say is that the kingdom has no hierarchy within it. That it isn't about, again, like this kingdom of heaven that the disciples are like, but how can I sit at the right hand? Or how can I be slightly higher? Like, Jesus is not looking at a org chart that flows down. It is much flatter than I think we imagine, right? We are sitting in this thing together. There's no hierarchy in the kingdom. And I would say the last thing, that it is quite scandalous, and it is scandalously inclusive in the sense that it is not about who you are or what you've done. We talk a lot about inclusion here, and for good, purposeful reasons. But one of the things that I would challenge us to really wholeheartedly think about and believe is that it is more inclusive than our perception of inclusion looks like. Many of us, when we think about who deserves to be there, who gets a seat at the table, or what that looks like, we still have a line of comfortability or a line of who we think is involved. And I would say the gospel of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, the one that we celebrate and march through and talk about this Lenten season and prepare for at Easter, it is scandalously inclusive. So much so that it's frustrating to the religious, and it sounds foolish to those that it's actually trying to invite and engage. And my hope would be for us that whether we're the person that it feels like scandal or the person that it feels like foolishness, that we might be able to reframe our economy of God's story and God's grace around one that invites us to walk more wholeheartedly with him, and with our neighbors, and invite others to do that in this journey. So with that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that you invite each and every one of us to this space, that it wasn't about what we did to get here or what we did before we got here. It's not even what we've done since we've been here. But God, that you meet us exactly the same just where we are. And so, God, I ask that you would just continue to stir and move in us to draw us closer to you and closer to one another. Help us see your story and your hope and your message, your mission of ultimate good news as one that we are all abundantly and wholeheartedly invited into. And so, God, be with us as we continue to worship, prepare our hearts to receive communion. We pray this all in Jesus' holy name. Amen.